Hello, viewers. Welcome back to another episode of How to Beat Beth Harmon. Today I'll be taking on the fifth Beth Harmon bot on chess.com, and this one has an estimated rating of 2400. That is well above my rating, so um, odds are not looking good here. Let's just be honest about that. So I'll give it my best shot. Let's see what happens. Oh, she says, I need more experience versus grandmasters. Are you that strong? Most definitely not. You really want to test your abilities in these positions against me? Um, well, I guess we'll just go for it. So usual, bring out pieces, control the center stuff that we talked about in the earlier videos. So here I'm attacking the pawn and she's defending it. So now I'll play this, which is going to attack the knight, which is holding that pawn together. Alright, she's going to ignore that and attack my pawn over here. This is all very well known. So now I castle, bring the king to safety. So she just zapped the pawn, but this is all still well known. I'm going to play pawn up here to try to open up this column, or we call columns files. So I can open up that file, then the king and the knight can be in some trouble. Okay, folks, that's a surprise. What pretty much everyone else does here is play a knight back to d6. This is a very common position back in the 2000 World Championship match between Kasparov and Kramnik. But bishop e7 is new to me, so um, let me give this one some thought. I think I'm just going to play pawn takes e5. That's going to make up for the pawn that I lost on e4. It also gives me a space advantage, so that means I just control more of the board than she does. So one good thing about her position is her knight on e4 is on a very nice square. So I'm looking for a way to try to challenge that knight and make it move to an inferior square. The main options I'm looking at are knight to d2 and rook to e1. I'm not so excited about bishop to d3 because then she just goes knight c5 and then she's hitting my bishop. I'm leaning towards knight d2 because that way if she plays knight g5, I can just take it, and then she plays bishop takes knight. Then I can play pawn to f4, followed by knight to e4, and now I've got the good square for my knight. So now I follow up with rook to e1 to put more pressure on that knight. Okay, that was a bit of a surprise. I thought she might play knight c5 to bring the knight to safety. The move I was mostly looking at was bishop to f5 to reinforce the knight. I was going to meet bishop f5 with bishop to d3, and then she can't protect the knight anymore. Now why bishop e6 surprised me is that it looks like I could just win a pawn. I can play knight takes knight, then pawn takes knight, swap queens, and then play rook takes e4. So, am I just getting a free pawn? Oh, maybe not. So, just to recap, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, then rook takes e4, And now she has this move bishop f5. And I have to somehow get my rook to safety, also protect my c2 pawn, and at the same time not get checkmated by rook to d1. I'm not seeing a good way to handle all of that. If I were to play, for example, let's say rook e2, then rook to d1 check, and then knight t1, and now she just takes the c2 pawn. I can't touch it with my rook because if I played rook takes c2, then she plays rook takes e1, and I'm in trouble. So it's not just a free pawn. So what can I do instead? I think I'll play queen e2 here. That's going to put more pressure on the knight and also avoid those problems. Okay, this is rather inconsistent. If she had wanted to play bishop f5, she could have done that a move ago. So I think I'll just keep putting more pressure on e4 and bring my bishop to d3. That makes things more complicated. I thought she was going to play the simpler knight takes d2. Now if I meet knight takes d2 with bishop takes f5, she could play knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, knight d4, queen moves somewhere, knight takes f5, queen takes f5. I feel like that's about equal, but I'm thinking I can get more out of this position. I was playing to meet knight takes d2 with playing bishop takes d2 instead. If she continues with bishop takes d3, I then play pawn takes d3 and follow up with pawn to d4. That just gives me a nice advantage in space. Now this makes things more complicated, the move she played in the game, f6 here, because she's ignoring the threat to her knight, and she's trying to counterattack my pawn on e5. So I could take the knight, or I could play pawn takes f6. Let's see. If knight takes e4, then pawn takes e4, bishop takes e4. I think she can play pawn takes e5, because then the rook guards the bishop. And then if I play bishop takes f5, rook takes f5, now the rook is guarding the pawn, and that just somehow our position is just holding together. That pawn e5 is kind of vulnerable, so maybe it will drop off at some point, but her pieces are getting active enough that she'll have compensation, I'm thinking. So maybe it's better to play pawn takes f6. Then she could play bishop takes f6, or she might try to get fancy and try to toss in knight takes d2 first. So if pawn takes f6, knight takes d2, I can play pawn takes e7, then knight takes f3 check. Then I can play pawn takes f3, and now she's in trouble because my pawn e7 is hitting both her queen and her rook. So she has to play knight takes e7, but then I play queen takes e7, and I have an extra piece, so that doesn't work for her. So if I play pawn takes f6, she cannot play knight takes d2. Pawn takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, bishop takes e4. I think I'm just up a pawn for nothing. Okay, she could try to pin me with rook e8, but then I can play queen c4 check and escape, so yeah, this looks good for me. So everything is going according to plan. So here a nasty move is queen to d3. We learned earlier that if you're ahead in material, and I have an extra pawn, so I'm ahead in material. If you're ahead in material, you want to trade pieces. So their queen d3, she is forced to trade queens because if she doesn't, then I just take another pawn on h7. She asks, do you like your chances after capturing my queen? As a matter of fact, I do. So I have a pawn for nothing. This could even turn out to be a win for me. Um, Not expecting that against a opponent who's supposedly 2400 rated. So the ratings are probably inaccurate here for the bots. I don't want this video to take half an hour, so let's end our episode here. And in the next episode, we'll see if I can convert this advantage into victory.